cameras off throughout the presentation and your microphones on mute. We will be recording this session. And so anything that you don't want recorded or your photos recorded, definitely keep those cameras and audio off. Okay, so with that, welcome to our webinar on compensatory education and recovery services. I'm trying to advance my slides here. Hang tight. Okay. It's taken a little while to get things in sync on my two computers. So good evening. Thank you again for joining us for this important discussion. We are going to keep the chat box open, but I'm going to ask everyone to hang tight on putting your questions in the chat box until the end of the presentation. We have tried to think of everything that you might ask or need to know right now, and we've included it in the presentation. And we've also received quite a few questions in advance. Those too have been included in the presentation at the end. So if you can just let us get through the slides, there's about 35 of them. And then if there are still questions to be asked, we'll invite you to put them in the chat box. We'll take as many as we can within our time limit going up to 8 o'clock. And then others we will address in other forums, or we'll get those questions and answers out to you by way of an email. Okay, so my name is Beth Benevides. I am Director of Outreach at the Hussman Institute for Autism and parent advocate with the Howard County Autism Society. And co-presenting with me this evening is Trish Gunshore from the Howard County School System. She's the coordinator of compliance and non-public services and family support in the Department of Special Education. And I'd also like to thank Melissa Rosenberg, the Executive Director of the Howard County Autism Society, and Suzanne Mason, our Resource Coordinator, for their help in pulling together tonight's presentation, as well as Mai Hall and Stephanie Carr from the Howard County Special Education Community Advisory Council. And of course, Ann Schultz from our Family Support and Resource Center for her help in announcing the presentation. We have quite a few people from the Department of Special Education leadership team with us this evening, and we'll jump right into the presentation, but because we have so much to cover. But I'd like to welcome Dr. Terry Savage, the Executive Director of Special Education, along with her leadership team, Janice Yetter, Jennifer Riccardi, and Dr. Emily Kinsler. They'll be here throughout the presentation and will be helping us with the questions, and also listening into what concerns families have. So Dr. Savage, would you like to say a few words before we get started?
Sure. Thank you so much, Beth, and good evening to everyone. I am Terry Savage, Executive Director for Special Education, and on behalf of my entire leadership team, I just want to express sincere appreciation for you giving your time this evening to join us. We know that these have been some very challenging times for so many of you, and I just want to express to you as parents, caregivers, other family members, how grateful we are for really everything that you have done to support your children and our students through some of the most difficult times we've ever faced. And I definitely never miss an opportunity to thank our teachers, our staff, our providers, our support teachers out there who have worked tirelessly alongside you to provide the services and other supports for our children as they so deserve. This is just the beginning. We are just getting our training efforts underway, and I look forward to hosting additional parent sessions for all of you. So please look out for those notices as well. And I'll turn it back over to Beth after I say thank you, thank you, thank you to all of our partners that helped us with this, CCAC and HCAS and other members of the Howard County Public School System staff. So welcome, everyone.
Beth, you are on mute.
Thank you. We'll get there. Okay. So let's get started here. Okay, so we know parents are very concerned about the services their children missed during COVID-19 school building closures, during virtual learning, and even now in hybrid learning. For students whose IEPs were not fully implemented, they may be eligible for compensatory or makeup services to get them where they would have been educationally if they had received all of their individualized services included in their IEPs. These services differ from recovery efforts to which all students will be entitled. And we'll discuss the important differences between the two so that parents are sure to use the right terminology when talking with their teachers and meeting with their IEP teams. We'll explain the necessary steps in the process to determine whether a student is eligible for compensatory education and recovery services, focusing heavily on the types of data that will be needed that will need to be collected and discussed. And we'll talk about your role as parents in the process, what your rights are, what your responsibilities are to participate in the decision-making as active partners in the IEP process. We'll talk about what you can do now if you feel your child has lost or continues to lose services or skills, and what you can do later if you're not happy with the offer the school makes for compensatory education services. So do any of these situations sound familiar? My child hated virtual learning, didn't get anything out of virtual, missed 20 minutes of speech each week, needed assessments that were delayed, had a service that couldn't be provided, or needed behavioral support during virtual learning. Well, if so, you're not alone. We know the past year has been really difficult for most children, and for kids with disabilities, the challenges have been even greater. For our youngest students, just the learning behaviors alone, going to school, sitting during lessons, paying attention, responding or interacting with peers, the basics of learning have been compromised. And add to that IEP goals that have not been worked on as they should have been, and we know there are plenty of issues to consider. So how do we address learning loss, lack of services, and the impact of COVID-19 on students with disabilities? There are two main remedies according to the Maryland State Department of Education recovery plan. I'm sorry, can everyone see the PowerPoint? I just saw something in the chat, and I'm just going to remind everybody to turn your audio on. The school systems will have to offer a system-wide recovery plan for all students, including students with disabilities. These are called recovery efforts. And under recovery efforts, Howard County's Department of Special Education has said that in addition to efforts for all students, the Department of Special Education may also consider providing supplemental support to groups of students due to the impacts of school closures. These supplemental COVID-19 impact supports would be provided by the Department of Special Education. And then the second main remedy is compensatory education recovery services. School systems will also have to examine the need for students with disabilities to receive compensatory education services. So let's talk a bit more about each of these. But first, an important reminder on who is accountable for learning loss. Schools are accountable for providing instruction and FAPE to students with disabilities. And it's important to maintain that accountability where it belongs, with schools. Although the school system may not have had any choice but to close school buildings and to offer only virtual instruction for a period of time, this may have had an impact on learning for students with disabilities. Recovery efforts and compensatory education recovery services address what was not provided. Either schools were unable to provide services or schools failed to provide services. Perhaps they never tried to add more one-to-one support, or they did not offer alternatives to virtual learning, or they didn't provide printed materials your child may have needed. In any case, the school was still responsible for your child's educational progress. And MSDE and Howard County's Executive Director of Special Education, Dr. Savage, made clear that even during the pandemic, with school closures, educational responsibilities and IEP obligations were not waived. Your child still was expected to make progress. And before we jump into the discussion of comp ed and recovery services, which I know everyone's anxious to get to, I also wanted to clarify a few things about IEP implementation. Many parents have asked which IEP will be in effect and implemented when their child returns to the school building. The normal operations IEP, or an IEP with alternative service delivery model amendment. So the school team will be implementing your child's normal operations IEP if all of the goals and objectives related services, supplementary aids and supports can be fully provided. If there are any goals, objectives, related services, or supplementary aids or supports that cannot be provided, the school team will be implementing an IEP that has that ASDM amendment in it. And if your child has already returned to school or will be returning to school while we're still in hybrid, your child's case manager will be contacting you to share information about your child's services and which IEP, the normal operations IEP or the IEP with the amendment will be implemented. Okay, so that's the first part of the process. The child returns to school, the case manager determines whether the normal operations IEP can be implemented or the ASDM amendment needs to be in place, or perhaps a revised amendment needs to be developed for in-person learning, and further revisions may be necessary. And then the case manager communicates that plan with parents. Okay, I'm switching to a different screen. Okay, that's the first part of the process. The second part of the process is to determine which services will be necessary for students with disabilities. Keep in mind that Howard County refers to recovery efforts for general education and compensatory education and recovery services for special education. And this is consistent with the technical assistance bulletin from MSDE to all local school systems. All of these services will have to be considered in order to bring the school system to the goal and expectation of moving students forward. So let's look at the difference between recovery efforts and compensatory education recovery services. When you see or hear the term recovery efforts or recovery plan, think system-wide, district-wide. This is a broad, sweeping plan on how schools will resume normal operations. This might include such things as different instruction blocks, focusing more heavily on reading or math, or longer instruction blocks, perhaps offering summer school or tutoring. And details for implementation of recovery efforts were developed by each individual school system. The purpose of the recovery plan was not to delineate individualized services, and they are not based on your students' individual IEP needs and services. They may be offered to all students or to large groups of students with and without disabilities who were impacted by COVID-19 closures. MSDE has added the requirement that every school system's recovery plan must continue to evaluate whether each student with a disability is being provided with FAPE. If a student was not or is not being provided with FAPE, then the discussion turns to compensatory education services that may be necessary. Compensatory education recovery services refers to special education instruction and or related services such as speech, OT, assistive technology, psychology. Those services owed to a student with disabilities as a result of a school system's failure, which is noted in the guidance, could be the inability as well as the unwillingness to provide the student with services in accordance with their IEP. The purpose of these services is to remediate the negative impact experienced by students due to the loss of FAPE. Compensatory education services are not unique to this pandemic, however. In this case, In this case, however, they may be provided due to the inability to implement the IEP during the period of extended school closure and heightened health and safety needs. They are not necessarily an hour-by-hour calculation. So even if your child had missed 15 hours of speech during the year-long closure, they may not get 15 hours of speech as makeup. They may get less, they may get more, depending on their needs. And we'll talk about all the considerations that are necessary for such decisions. And Comp Ed is designed to place students where they would have been if it was not for the denial of FAPE. Compensatory education is not just about regression, and this is very important for parents to keep in mind. We're not just using, the factor of whether a child regressed as a determination. It's also about the progress that was made or not made. When students receive FAPE, we expect they will have moved forward and made measurable progress. So if your child is at the same place as they were 1 year ago when schools closed and they have not made progress, that is as much a factor in the determination of compensatory education as if they had regressed. Okay, students are expected to make progress year to year.
So before we talk about how parents will find out whether their child will receive compensatory education services, let's talk about how teams will determine whether a child has regressed, made adequate progress or not, or has new or different needs. All decisions related to the special education programming for the student will be driven by data. This means that before school teams can make a decision about compensatory education recovery services, schools will review data on the student. The Maryland State Department of Education provides important guidance called Technical Assistance Bulletins, or TABs, that remind teachers of the importance of data collection and progress monitoring in order to support students and their needs as they transition back to schools. This data helps staff provide specially designed instruction that is aligned to the student's individual needs. It will also be the basis for compensatory education discussions. Before, during the pandemic, and now as we head back into in-person learning, schools have been required to conduct ongoing data collection and progress monitoring. MSDE made it very clear that data collection was and is required throughout the pandemic. And Dr. Savage echoed that in Howard County and expects teachers and providers to have data to support discussions and decision-making. Pre-closure or pre-virtual instruction. What data is there? There is data from March 2020 that provides a baseline of how the students were performing prior to school closure. There are also progress reports prior to school closure. This baseline data from prior to the school closures will allow for a comparison to new current data to demonstrate progress or regression. During virtual instruction and distance learning, data should have been collected from spring 2020 through winter of 2021. When looking at this data, the team gains information about the student's progress on IEP goals and objectives and maintenance of skills and knowledge. A student's ability to attend virtual learning, such as their attendance records and logs, their ability to engage, and parents can provide important information here. Additional data that could be discussed might include information on the individualized supports that a student required and who provided it, such as a teacher, paraeducator, parent, or another adult support. Data has been captured in a variety of ways to include service logs, input from parents, communication and consultation logs, and how many hours of related services were provided and how many hours of specialized instruction in and out of the general ed setting. Now, as we return to school and students transition back to in-person learning, staff continue to collect data. They will need new baseline data for students. This data can be used for multiple purposes. In addition to using data for the primary responsibility of making programmatic adjustments to ensure student learning, the data is also part of how the school team tracks progress, recoupment, or regression. All of this data together can inform the next steps for IEP or ASDM implementation and the compensatory education recovery services process. Also critically important, and in some cases more important than what teachers saw, is what parents saw and experienced with their children. Your child may have learned and responded differently when learning at home rather than at school. As a parent, you may have or may continue to collect data at home, especially if you are receiving ABA services. As part of the IEP team, you may elect to collect your own data and present it. While not required of parents and perhaps overwhelming on top of everything else you're managing, you can bring this data to the IEP team meeting, and the team must consider the data and discuss its impact. MSDE has published and disseminated multiple guiding documents for schools and some for parents on this topic. Your child may learn and respond differently when learning at home rather than at school. And parents are always encouraged to be part of their child's IEP process, and this means asking questions about the data as well. Once all of the data has been collected and shared, how can we analyze it? What kinds of things are we looking for? And how should we evaluate for compensatory services? And how can you prepare for these discussions? So once all the multiple sources of data have been collected, it's important to analyze the data on your child's learning. This should have been done throughout the pandemic, but it's especially important as students return to in-person learning, and we try to assess where they were and where they are now. Specially designed instruction has to be aligned with the IEP to narrow any gaps. Consider whether your child learned what was expected. Did they meet their targets? Analyze your child's engagement. Was your child engaged in learning while virtual? Were there patterns of engagement or frustrations? Was your child able to access or engage in one platform better than another? And finally, note any gaps that exist, either gaps that have narrowed with progress or gaps that are new as a result of the school closure. So as you prepare for discussions or evaluations about your child's present levels on academic and non-academic goals, all this data that you analyze will be critically important. Remember, data prior to school closure, during, and then returning to hybrid and eventually fully in person will all be necessary to determine your child's current needs to receive FAPE, whether your child is eligible for compensatory education services, and what compensatory education services will be necessary. All of the data collected by teachers and related service providers, as well as families, and even outside experts will be useful information. And this data we use to develop present levels of academic performance. Remember MSDE's guidance. The decision about whether the student is owed compensatory education recovery services must be driven by information and data collected from a variety of sources. And this information will guide the decision-making process. According to MSDE, data on the student's progress prior to and during the school closure, specifically data to evaluate academic and or behavioral progress in the general education curriculum and on the student's IEP goals will be considered. We might consider grades, progress reports, attendance, etc. Again, keep in mind that we're not only looking for regression, in addition to whether a child regressed or lost skills, we're also considering whether a child made expected progress in the last year, whether IEPs were fully implemented or partially implemented through the individual continuity of learning plan or the ASDM plan. Expectation is that the student would have made progress in the last year and not just maintain skills where they were 1 year ago. We need to consider data on the student's ability to recoup skills in order to make progress on IEP goals once they return to school, and how long it might take a student to recoup those skills. This depends on that child's individual IEP and circumstances. In addition, documentation of accommodations and services provided, including those provided by parents or caregivers during virtual learning, as well as accommodations, supplementary aids, and related services that the school was unable to provide during the extended closure and the reopening. The length of school closure must also be considered, including information related to the general curriculum provided to all students and the student's ability to access virtual and or distance learning opportunities. All of this information will be critical to discuss what your child may need as they return to school and hopefully to normal school operations. Teams will need to determine whether the services provided to your child during the period of school closure and reopening were appropriate to allow your child to make progress in the general education curriculum and on their IEP goals and objectives. As with any other year, the goal is always that the student will have made progress on their IEP goals and objectives from 1 year ago. If services were not appropriate to allow progress, then teams have to discuss compensatory education services that may be necessary. School systems were required to provide FAPE throughout the pandemic, and the threshold question that should be asked to determine possible entitlement to compensatory education is whether there was a denial of FAPE. I'm sure many of you are asking, when should you request compensatory education, and does it require an IEP meeting? Since we will be discussing this for all of our students with disabilities, each student will be evaluated, and the parents and families will be notified of that evaluation. The Disability Rights Maryland put out advice on when you should be making that request, and they shared that the decision should not be made until there is enough information about the services your child did and did not receive, that there is enough information about how your child did academically, functionally, socially, and behaviorally, and how your child is doing once they return back to a school building full time. Therefore, Howard County is looking at all three of those pieces of data and focusing on those students who have currently returned back to school buildings first. All students with an IEP will be evaluated for compensatory services. The first thing that you will notice is you will receive a letter with a parental input form. Just like the parental input form that you receive during your annual review, we're asking that you provide that input to your child's case manager. It's important that you share the information or data that you noticed while your child was home on virtual instruction. Once you provide that data to your child's case manager, you will receive a compensatory education recovery services offer from the Howard County Public Schools. Once you receive that offer, it will come with a cover letter and allow you a few options. You will have the option to agree with the proposed offer of compensatory education recovery services, or it will allow you to submit additional input and requests for consideration. As you are aware, parents always have the right to request an IEP meeting at any point during this process. So let's look at the part 3 of the process. The case manager will send home a parental input form and ask you to complete that form and return it to them, the case manager. You will then receive a compensatory education recovery services offer from your child's case manager. You will either agree with the offer or submit additional information for consideration. When you're in agreement, the compensatory education recovery services will be provided. So let's talk about when you're not in agreement. If you're not in agreement with the offer, again, you may request an IEP meeting at any time during this process, but we're also sharing with you that you may contact other people that can assist you, such as CCAC, HCAS, Parents Place of Maryland, the Family Support Resource Center, or the Department of Special Education. You also have the option to file a complaint with the Maryland State Department of Education, as well as file a request for mediation or hearing. If the school system determines that your child that compensatory education services are not required for your child, or you disagree with them, you may do any of the following, but we are encouraging you to complete the form that you will receive, providing your feedback to the school. That feedback will then be reviewed by a team and will receive a response. You will then have the opportunity after that feedback, again, to request an IEP meeting.
And I just want to let parents know that Disability Rights Maryland has created a sample complaint letter. We have posted it on the Howard County Facebook page, and we also added it to our special education resources on our website. And basically, it is just a sample for parents to see how to write a letter to MSDE complaining that their child did not receive services, or FAPE, that their child did not receive FAPE. It guides the family on what information to include, and it provides examples of how students may have been affected. So parents can just kind of select, like there's a bunch of different options. Parents can check a box and then provide the information to support their argument that FAPE was not provided. It provides additional information on who to address, where to send it, and all that kind of stuff. So it's for those parents that are considering filing a complaint letter, if none of these other remedies work, if working with the team is not satisfactory, then parents always have the option of filing a state complaint. So I encourage you just to look at the parents' guidance on this on our website, as well as that sample complaint letter. And we've been asked, our IEP team meetings going to be required, and they're not required, but again, as Trish said, always remember that parents may request an IEP meeting at any time. It may look different than the annual meeting and may focus on only one area of your child's educational services as opposed to all areas. But if you have concerns, you may absolutely call an IEP meeting. And even if you do not call an IEP meeting, definitely talk with your case manager, share information, meet with the team informally, meet with the team formally, whatever feels most comfortable to you. Provide that parental input, especially on virtual learning. It's critical that the team knows what your child experienced at home. And then again, when you receive that compensatory education determination or offer, you can request an IEP meeting at that time as well. One of the resources that we refer to throughout this presentation has been the MSDE Technical Assistance Bulletin number 20-09. And this is all about recovery efforts. So this is the guidance that school systems receive. This is guidance that parents can refer to on what should be happening for students with disabilities as schools reopen. So I encourage families to look at that and review it. There's frequently asked questions in there that may answer, some of your questions as well. These are just resources that you can turn to when you receive your offer letter, or you have questions on what information you should provide the school in advance, what you should start collecting now. If you'd like to just talk to one of us advocates about that, we're happy to support you through that. So you have resources within the Department of Special Education that's outside of your school building. We have resources at the Family Support and Resource Center, CCAC. We have parent advocates at the Howard County Autism Society. We have support from Disability Rights Maryland, and Parents Place of Maryland also has parent advocates to speak with you.
Beth, can you advance the slides?
I'm so sorry. Yep, I sure can. That's the Technical Assistance Bulletin I just referred to. These are some of the resources I just mentioned. All that can provide you with one-to-one support and answer questions you may have, helping you prepare for your discussions. And then the additional compensatory conversations are going to be hosted by Howard County School, the Family Support and Resource Center, and the Department of Special Education. So these are dates that they're going to be offered in times. The registration link is not yet open, but we'll definitely share that information. And if you have questions, you can always email Ann Schultz at that email address that's provided there as well. And so I know parents are going ahead and putting in questions, so hang tight a second. We do have some frequently asked questions that we received in advance, and we're going to go through them now. And hopefully, again, they will answer some of the questions that you have as well. Okay, so Trish, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to you.
Okay, So the first question was who will provide these services and when they will be provided. So as with your typical IEP, the compensatory education recovery services will be individualized and will probably look different from one child to another. So for some students, it could mean a few minutes extra of speech added onto each session. For another student, it might mean adding something totally new. And for some students, it might mean we are contracting with tutoring or related services. So for some students, it could be with their current teachers or service providers. For others, it might be with contracted outside service providers. So for students who are turning 21 and exiting in June, the question was, is it possible for the IEP team to consider extending their education for another school year to complete their studies or their work experiences? As many of you know, there was a bill presented this year putting forth this possibility that all students who are turning 21 would get an additional year of schooling. That bill did not pass. So for students who are turning 21, those are the first groups of students that will be examining for compensatory education recovery services, just like we will be for everyone else. And if the data shows that they require compensatory ed recovery services, those services will be delivered to that student. But because the decision is individualized, some students may just require a short period of time, a few weeks, while others may require a longer period of time. But we are not, at this point in time, still examining our options for supporting all of those transitioning students. So there will more than likely more information to come. So for students who attend non-public schools, how does this apply? The non-public case manager from Howard County Public Schools will work with the non-public school to go through this same process of determining whether that student requires compensatory education or recovery services. For students who just started their IEP, like right prior to the school closure, what kinds of data will be used to assess progress? That student's initial evaluation will be used to help determine that, as well as the present levels that the child had on that initial IEP that they started just 2 weeks prior to the closure. And that information will be examined in conjunction with the progress they made during the school closure and where they are currently. So for students whose initial assessment has been delayed, and we know that we have some students in this category, will compensatory education recovery services be considered? So for those students who do qualify for special education services, compensatory education recovery services will be considered. So this question is, does anyone outside the school team give input? So we've shared earlier that we're encouraging and inviting families to provide data about how their child did while they were home. Additionally, if the family has outside providers that they have been working with throughout the pandemic, we will examine and consider that information, as families are always an integral part of the IEP team. If after working with the school team, the parents continue to disagree with the determination that is made, we will be encouraging parents to contact the Department of Education for further discussion. And again, if there's still disagreement, parents can certainly exercise their rights to request an IEP meeting, file a state complaint, or file for mediation in due process. We do look at this as a very collaborative process because the parents have lots of information since you've spent lots of time with your children during virtual learning. And so we look at your information that you will be sharing with the IEP teams as very valuable as we make these determinations. So we encourage you to share that data with the schools. And then once you receive the offer, if you still have concerns, reach back to your school team and/or the Department of Special Education. Some of you have paid for private speech or related services during the closure, or had providers working with your child either in your home or virtually as well. Can you seek reimbursement? So if this is the case, when you're asked to provide that input prior to compensatory education services determination, we encourage you to add that information to that input, that initial input that we're requesting from the family. And you provide that to your school teams for them to consider. I'm sure you all want to know, my child received compensatory services, when will they start? At this time, we are developing options for both Howard County Public School staff to provide services, as well as outside providers to deliver these services. And so once you're provided with your offer, you will then, after you're provided with your offer, you will then receive subsequent information on when and how those services will be provided. So those are the questions we received prior to this presentation. So I'm thinking we might be able to get to some of those that are in the chat.
Yeah, we got through that a lot quicker than I thought we might. There was so much information. I know that is an awful lot of information for parents to process, and we try to include as much as possible in these slides so that you will have this information and can go back to it. We're going to post the slides, of course, on the Howard County Autism Society site, and we'll share it with the Department of Special Education to send out as well, and CCAC. But it's very important for you to take this PowerPoint presentation and just go through it slide by slide, especially the things that we have shared with you that teams will be considering. Because if you as parents know what teams are going to be looking at, we encourage you to look at it yourself. So go ahead and start creating that case for your child on your own so that you can fully participate in the discussions. When you send in your parental input, you'll have all that information already listed out for teams to consider. You'll have a much stronger case if you understand what they really are going to be looking at. So with that, I invite you now to put questions that you have in the chat box. I did see one earlier that a parent asked whether compensatory services were going to be based on how your child did while during virtual learning. So as other parents go ahead and put their questions in, I'm just going to back up a few slides so that, Trish, perhaps you can just go over again the 3 different periods of time when that will be looked at. So let me just get to that slide really quickly. Okay, so that is the data that's going to be considered. So it's not just compensatory services are not going to be based just on how your child did while doing virtual learning. It's actually all of these different data points will be taken into consideration. And then Trish, a question was asked, again, this goes back to the timing for children that are not returning this year, and are not returning to full in-person learning this year. When will this consideration take place?
Right. So since we've received guidance from several sources about the data that you need to have prior to making these decisions, we are considering those students who have returned to in-person learning first, but we've also prioritized our graduating seniors or students who are transitioning out of the school system. So those will be the first students that we will be examining for compensatory services, because we realize that they're finishing their tenure here in Howard County Public Schools And so we need to make those offers to those students who will require those services first. The second group of students we're looking at prioritizing are students who are transitioning preschool to kindergarten, elementary to middle, or middle to high. And the reason we're looking at those students is because we would like the current team that knows those students to be examining that data and making those offers. We're also looking at examining our students who we know and didn't do well on virtual learning. But in order to, with the exception of the graduating seniors, in order to make any of these decisions, they have to be students who have returned to in-person learning, so we could look at how they are currently doing. Either are they currently making progress, and or have they recouped from any regression they've made.
And Trish, regarding the IEP and whether a child's full IEP would be implemented, the normal school operations IEP, or whether the IEP with an amendment, the ASDM amendment, would be implemented now that kids have been back in school, what should parents have already heard from their case managers as to which IEP is being implemented now? Or is there a timeline for that? And what if a parent hasn't heard and is wondering?
Yeah, if they haven't heard, I would encourage you to contact your case manager. You should be hearing from your case manager about which of those IEPs your case manager is implementing at this time. So if you haven't heard from them, I would encourage you to reach.
Okay, great. And then I don't know if you or Dr. Savage would like to speak to the question about assessments and bring parents up to date on where we are with assessments, how assessments are being done, knowing that we, like many counties, are very behind on the assessment process and reevaluations. But there is a question that said one of the parents had mentioned that her child is waiting to be reassessed and has been waiting since March of last year. And when will those assessments, catch up or take place?
So let me just clarify here that for students who already have an IEP, the assessment as to whether they qualify for compensatory education recovery services is not necessarily based on formalized assessments. It is based on the assessment of where they were prior to virtual learning, like maybe their present levels from their IEP prior to virtual learning, their progress reports on their IEP, data that teachers have been collecting either during virtual or that they're collecting now. So those compensatory education decisions are not necessarily based on formal assessments. So that's part one of that answer. Part two of that answer is, yes, we know that we, like many other districts across the country, have a backlog of assessments to be conducted on our students, whether that be reevaluations or initial evaluations. So if your child has either a reevaluation or an initial evaluation, and it is determined that for an initial, they qualify for special education services, we will examine compensatory services for the time period that they should have qualified. I see in this question, the child should have been assessed in last March. Let's say we get to the assessment this month. We would look at the services they missed since last March until this month and make a compensatory offer. If it is a reevaluation, and during that reevaluation, they make a determination that the child would have required a new service, we will look at the compensatory services that they should have gotten since that last evaluation on the new service.
Okay, and I see a couple questions, and I know for many of us, it's hard to wrap our heads around how these compensatory services are going to be provided, and because there's limited hours in the day, and whether they're going to be provided during school or after school. And I think to answer that, and Trish, please, continue on this. It's, again, these discussions are all going to be very individualized for your student. And so it will depend on what your child needs, how many extra minutes of any service they need, or how, whether we're talking about tutoring or outside services. All of that has to be considered. First, the assessed needs have to be considered, and then the question of how they will be delivered. Trish, is there anything to add to that?
I'm going to add that we are looking at all kinds of options. So for some students, we may be able to provide their compensatory services within their school day. But for many students, we will be looking at providing those services beyond the school day. That might be in the summer, that might be after school hours, might be on weekends, it might be with our Howard County Public School staff, it might be with contractual staff. So we are looking outside the box at all kinds of ways we can provide compensatory services. Please also note that we realize that for some students, we may not complete their compensatory services in this school year or within this calendar year. And it may take us more than a calendar year to complete compensatory services owed to some students.
Great. And then another parent had asked, within the IEP itself, where should parents look? Where will this information be captured as to where a child's progress is, where they were pre-pandemic, during virtual and hybrid, and then, of course, where they are current levels once they're returned and assessed. How is that going to be outlined in the IEP? And then for the parental input section of it, any of the data that the parents present, will that be included in that part of the discussion, kind of where we find current levels, or will that only be in the parent input? I mean, where should parents be looking for this information when they get their child's IEP?
Right, so you should be looking at two parts, particularly of your child's IEP, in their levels of performance and in the quarterly progress reports that you receive from your case manager. Those are the two areas that showed prior to March 2020, where your child was at that point in time, their quarterly progress that you received every quarter. So you should, after March 20th, you probably received one somewhere around April of last year, and then June of last year, October of this year, January of this year, and you will be receiving another one shortly in the next week or so. So your quarterly progress reports and your present levels of performance. In addition to that, your teachers have been doing their usual data collection about your child's work. So they will be looking at that. And then your parental input will not be captured necessarily in the IEP, but it will be captured on that form that we're asking you to complete of parental input that we will use prior to making the decision about compensatory service.
Okay, and another parent asked, mentioned that her daughter's IEP was implemented in January of this year, and so the annual review is not till January of next year, and she's asking whether she should request an IEP meeting to talk about compensatory services. So again, I just remind everyone of the process that Trish has outlined, where the data will be collected, an offer, a compensatory, your input will be requested, and then an offer will be made from the school system. A determination offer will be made from the school system. And it's at that point that parents can request IEP meetings if they feel that it's necessary to discuss with teams if they're not happy with the offer or they think more information needs to be discussed. So you absolutely do not have to wait a full year to have an IEP meeting. You never do. And that's just an important point for parents to know, is that at any point you can call an IEP meeting if you feel one is necessary. So we're not encouraging parents to call IEP meetings now. We're encouraging parents to wait until they have received the information from the school, and at that point, if they feel they need to have an IEP meeting, they can go ahead and request it. Before we get, keep putting your questions in the chat box, and we'll be coming back to them. I did want to invite Jen Riccardi to speak with parents who may have children birth to 3, just to share a little bit about this process for those families. So Jen, if you're on the line and would like to jump on and say a few words, we'd welcome you to do that.
Hi, Beth. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Riccardi, the Coordinator for Early Intervention Services. I did just want to take a minute to let you all know that we are working on developing the guidelines for our children who are in infants and toddlers services who are served under an IFSP. As you can imagine, our services, because the delivery model is so different, and that the bulk of our work is coaching parents or caregivers, our process is going to be quite different. Nevertheless, we are working diligently to get that ready for you. You will hear directly from either your service coordinator or a general information that will come directly from my office regarding next steps, including some evening hours where we will be available to answer your questions in person. Well, virtually in person. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have tonight about infants and toddlers. Just know that that process is still being developed. Thanks, Beth.
Thank you. Okay, so getting back to our questions, there is one about transitioning youth, and the question is whether the student, a student who is expected to graduate in June, who may be able to receive services into next school year under compensatory education, whether they would graduate in June or whether their graduation would be held until they completed those services. And the parent says that distinction is important for DDA eligibility.
I am because I'm pausing on that question and seeing if Janice Yetter might be able to answer that. Not something I had thought about or discussed.
Hi, everyone. This is Janice Yetter, Director of Special Education. So what we would want to do is be sure that we're working collaboratively with your transition specialist, your DDA chosen provider, and our school system. So as we develop these compensatory services, we are going to most likely be working collaboratively with those providers to determine when and how those services can be provided. So we are looking for more guidance on how that will be delivered, and we're getting updates daily from MSDE on how to move forward with working with our adult providers during this process.
Thank you, Janice. So Trish, with regard to the timeline, and we've kind of explained to parents what the process will be, but parents are asking, is there an exact timeline? Are there dates by which families should be expected to hear, from their case managers? Does it depend on when the child is back to full in-person services or sooner? What should their expectations be in terms of receiving the parental input form from the team, returning it, that kind of stuff?
So I want you to understand that we will be making contact with all families. So if you don't hear soon, you will hear information from your child's case manager. So please note that we will be sending this information to every student who has an IEP and an IFSP. We do, though, need to prioritize some student groups, particularly those students who are graduating and or aging out of the system, so that we can make those offers before those students leave us and go on to new and bigger endeavors. And then, as I stated earlier, we will be looking at 4-year-old preschoolers who are transitioning to kindergarten, 5th graders, 8th graders, 5th graders and 8th graders, so that those offers can be made by the teams that know those students and have known them for a while. So those are the first families that will hear, and those families will receive initially that letter asking you for your input. We're not going to send the input request to all families because we feel like if we don't make your compensatory decision for 2 months, you might have different or new input to offer us in 2 months. So we won't share that input or request for input until right before we are looking at your child to make their determination for compensatory education services. So once we're ready for your child, we will send you that request for your input. And the form does ask, we'll give you a time frame in which to provide that input back to the school teams. So I encourage you now, if you've been gathering data, to get that data together. If you have checklists or videos or pictures or work samples, I encourage you to begin gathering all that information so that when you receive that letter from the school, you have that information to provide to your school teams. They will take that information, send an offer to you, and then again, you will be given a deadline or due date to respond to that offer.
Good evening to everyone again. This is Terry Savage, Executive Director. I just want to chime in there just to iterate those points again. While we are beginning with some students before others, I do want to assure you that we are taking a very aggressive approach to implementing this plan. There are a lot of parts and pieces to it, as you can imagine, and one of the critical parts was to ensure that we got training for you underway and multiple sessions to follow. We are at the same time beginning our training and continuing actually our training with school staff. They've had their first pieces around data collection. We're preparing those next steps for their professional learning, etc. So I do want to assure you that while we don't have dates attached to a timeline, that we are moving aggressively through this implementation plan. And if you have any concerns at all about the timing, anything like that, please feel free to reach out to any of us. All of our contact information was there. And please, please be encouraged with what Trish and Beth have shared this evening in terms of getting prepared, pulling information together. It's a lot. It's a lot. So do pull that information together. Make your notes, videos, anything that you would like to have as part of the process. Get that ready so that once you receive the parent input form, that you can provide that information to us, and the process will begin for your particular child and family.
Thank you. And can you explain what the offer letter will look like for parents? And will it be similar to the ASDM offer where, documents were attached to say what exactly was going to be provided? Will it include the data that was considered so that parents know how you arrived at the decision or at the initial offer? What exactly should parents expect to see?
So the offer letter will come with a cover letter with some information to explanatory information. And then you will see a document that teams will work through on the second page. That document is modeled after the Maryland State Department of Education document that they provided that asks about the implementation, the development and implementation of what in our county we called an ICOL plan and an ASDM plan. So not every county called it the same thing. So it asks about, did you develop those plans and did you implement those plans? And if you didn't, what part of those plans were you unable to implement? It then asks questions that Beth has been sharing throughout this presentation about, was there a lack of progress made, or was there regression and your child did not recoup? So those are the 5 main areas that the form will ask. Once it has determined that data has determined that you require compensatory services, that form will outline what services your child requires compensatory services for. So your child may receive several different kinds of services on their current IEP, but maybe only the data may only show that they require compensatory services for one of those things. So it will include the service that they require, The type of provider, not the name of the provider, but a type, a special education teacher, speech language pathologist, audiologist, etc. And it includes the total amount of hours that they require for their compensatory services. After receiving that, the parent will then be able to respond with, I agree with your offer of these services and this amount of hours, or I don't agree, and here's some more input as to why I don't agree.
Thanks, Trish. And I imagine we can, once the parent input form is finalized, that is something that we could share in advance with parents, just so that not that they would be invited to send it in until the case manager asked for it, but that they could go ahead and start planning and pulling that information together. Is that something that you think we could share with parents when it's finalized?
I think
the parent input form.
Yeah, I think that's something we can take back to consider, certainly.
Oh, great. Yeah, I think the earlier that, just like, parents know in advance what questions are going to be asked for their IEP parental input, those questions are pretty standard. If we could get parents that information earlier, that would be better for them. And then one parent asked you mentioned about videos and any data that parents collected. And while we weren't suggesting that parents videotape class sessions, we were suggesting if you have videos, showing your child, couldn't attend, or behaviors that were going on that impacted their learning, or anything like that, that could be, or if your child was doing something really great and making progress at home and you captured that as well to share with the team. Those are the types of videos that we were referencing.
That is correct. Thank you, Beth.
Yes, but thank you for that question. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so again, I invite anybody else. I think we've answered most of the questions, if not all of them. Did you answer the question, Trish, about kids that have already returned to 4.5 days a week, and whether they're included in that group of students that would be initially considered for offer letters?
So we have looked at determining the students that we are looking at first, again, those seniors or students aging out of the school system, and then our transitioning students at all our grade levels, so that the team that knows that student best can make that offer. So those are the students we'll be looking at first.
Okay, and then another really good question is, what would be the best resource if we feel our compensatory offer is inadequate? So again, I think we outline the process for if you feel that it's inadequate. There are many people that you could speak to. Let me get that slide back up here of just some of the suggestions that we had. You can, of course, if you have gone back with your IEP team and you don't feel, you're not in agreement, you still don't feel that they are offering you, a good offer, you can always reach out to the Department of Special Education, to Trish Gunshore's office. In particular, they'll be considering disagreements between families and school teams. The Family Support and Resource Center, you can speak to parent advocates there, as well as CCAC. At the Howard County Autism Society, we are always happy to speak one-on-one with parents, to take a look at the offer that was received and offer some advice on what additional information you might be able to provide, what seems fair or not fair about the offer that you received, and give you some advice and talking points for you to use with the school system. And those are just some things. Disability Rights Maryland invites that as well, and Parents Place of Maryland, they have one-to-one parent advocate appointments as well. So really, you want to, we advise parents to exhaust all of those free resources that are available to you first. And of course, then if you are not happy, or you're not making progress, and want to consult someone else, you can always file that state complaint, and you can exercise your rights to mediation and due process. You can hire an advocate or attorney as well. So there's many different levels of this depending on where you want to start. But we certainly are here to help parents through this process, and to help them just be able to articulate what they really feel the school needs to know about how this last year has been for their child, and the regression or lack of progress that they've noted. So it really should be a collaborative effort with the team to come to this decision. And we want parents to know, the decisions never end at your school. So if you're not happy with something within your school building and with your teachers and case managers, there's an entire central office, Department of Special Education, that's there to support parents as well. Every school has a resource teacher. Every school has an instructional facilitator. And we have the office, the Family Support Office that Trish heads. So please know that the offer that comes home to you, if you're not happy with it or with any IEP team decision, that's not where you have to stop. There's many other people that can help with these discussions. And quite often it is just parents talking through and being able to articulate things differently or knowing what, how to kind of make their case. So I encourage you to reach out for more support if you feel that you're not being heard or you feel unhappy with the decision that the school has made.
Yeah, and I want to thank you for that, Beth, because the way we're trying to roll out the process is to be very collaborative with families and ask for your input on at several points of the process, prior to making the offer, but as well as once you receive the offer. Once you receive the offer, if you are not in agreement with the offer and you provide that feedback on the form that you'll receive, someone will respond to you with information about the feedback that you have responded. So that's the second point of contact. And then the third point of contact could be that we get to an IEP meeting and we have an IEP meeting where you again are providing your input at the table. So we really do look at this as a collaborative process with our families all along the way until we come to an offer that you are comfortable with and that the data displays that will be required for your child.
And then there's a great question about whether ESY counts toward recovery efforts, compensatory education services. No, it does not. And we had a whole presentation on ESY services and the differences between ESY and compensatory services recovery efforts. That presentation is on the Howard County Autism Society website. I don't know if Suzanne or Melissa might be able to put the link to that. We have the PowerPoint posted as well as the recorded session on ESY. So I encourage parents to take a look at that and understand the difference between the two. But no, ESY does not count as compensatory services.
But it doesn't, compensatory services can't be, they can both be provided in the summertime.
Right.
But, right.
Yeah, but compensatory services isn't of now your child qualifies for extended school year services. That's
Correct.
Not the same.
Correct.
There's the eligibility criteria for ESY, and ESY offer parents should have had their ESY eligibility determination meetings by now. I do encourage parents again to take a look at these dates for the additional. Don't mean to keep flipping through here, but there's good information. The additional compensatory conversations that the school system is going to be hosting. This is where you'll find up-to-date information, perhaps on the process and where we are in the process, or where the school system is in the process on which priority groups are being addressed. There is going to be a Spanish webinar for Spanish-speaking families as well on June 2nd. So keep those dates in mind and just keep an eye out when you get your newsletter in your email from the Family Support Center as for registration links.
Dr. Sapp, there's been a few questions about plans for the fall for the school system. I wonder if you might address that question.
I can find my unmute. Okay, so the question was, Trish, please repeat.
There's been a few questions about plans for the fall for the system as a whole and how that might impact or fall into any of these discussions. And I'm not sure we know plans for the fall yet, but you might have some information.
Correct. We are still in the infancy of those discussions very publicly. Those are discussions that are held as part of our Howard County Board of Education meetings. Those plans are still underway. I do know, of course, it is the hope of our superintendent that we are able to return students as safe to do so in person back to a sense of normal operation. So we have been working through our bridge to normalcy, as he calls it, and it began with our reentry March 1st with the phased-in approach, and we're continuing to have those discussions about how to build upon the transition for additional students in terms of the fall. Now, again, if you're following the Board of Education meetings, that is a place where many of those discussions get discussed, as it is a decision-making process that occurs with input from our Board of Education under the direction of our superintendent.
Thank you. Okay, and a final question that's been asked, or almost final, and then I just want to give Mai Hall and Stephanie Carr a moment to say a few words about CCAC and how parents can join CCAC, which is our Special Education Community Advisory Committee. But one question was asked about the use of contractors. If Howard County is going to be using outside evaluators to catch up on some of the assessments, will those evaluators be invited to participate in the IEP process? Can parents, have those people included? And I would just remind parents that at any part of the IEP process, they can invite whomever they feel would help them advocate for their children or have something to contribute to the conversation to an IEP meeting. So if that's an outside assessor that the parents hired or had an assessment done, they can always invite those to participate. But if Howard County is hiring a contractor, how will their input be provided to the IEP process?
I can jump into that. So, oh, Emily, I think is Dr. Kinsler here.
I am here, Terry.
Dr. Kinsler's here, and it's an opportunity for her to introduce herself as well. Go ahead, Emily.
Hello, everybody. I'm Emily Kinsler. I'm the coordinator for countywide services. Thanks for that question about the assessment. It'll be handled in one of two ways. The assessors that we're hiring, the contractors to help support them, are spending most of their days either doing the assessments or then writing the assessment up if they're not a Howard County employee. They take that assessment, they share it with the team, they share it with their peer, so an SLP to an SLP, an educator to an educator, and review the assessment there. The contractor can be asked to attend the review of assessment meeting if there's any question or if the parent requests it, but they will not be involved in the writing of the IEP goals and objectives. That will be the school-based team who typically know the student much better. But for the most part, it will be the school-based team that will take over from the assessor so that the assessors can keep on doing the writing. However, at any time, an assessor can be invited to a review of an assessment meeting.
Thank you, Emily. And I just wanted to add on to that process is really not new for us in Howard County. Some families may be familiar with that process if they have received outside evaluations in the past, or they have other types of service providers that they would like to have as part of the meetings to provide information about that child's strengths, needs, etc. So that part of the process is really not new. So we are continuing with the way that we would normally operate there, and we invite everyone into the process if it means that we're going to develop a more meaningful program for the children.
I'm sorry, I'm talking to myself here and I'm muted. Thank you, Dr. Savage. And I just wanted to add, I'm assuming that, just as parents receive any report in advance, any written report or assessment on their child in advance of an IEP meeting, if that parent had direct questions for the assessor or evaluator, could they ask for additional input, or could they ask the assessor to answer specific questions? Or are you suggesting that someone from the school system would answer those questions?
So Beth, I'm suggesting it could be either way.
Sorry. Okay.
It will depend on the student and the needs and the complexity of the assessment that was completed, I think.
Okay, great. But again, parents, should receive within 5 school days, at least 5 days of school days before an IEP meeting to discuss an assessment. You must receive any report so that you have time to review it. And if at that time you have additional questions, then you can certainly call them.
If there are additional questions that a family has, or that they would want an assessor to be there, they would reach out to the school-based team so that that team member can get in touch with the assessor.
Right, or the meeting be rescheduled if that's necessary as well. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Kinsler. Thank you to everyone who has presented tonight and jumped in to answer questions or provide additional information. I just wanted to give Mai or Stephanie a moment to come on and introduce yourself and CCAC to families so that they know who you are and why it's so important to join CCAC.
Sure. Hello, my name is Mai Hall. I am one of the co-chairs for the Howard County CCAC, and we are the Special Education Citizens Advisory Committee. Specifically, we provide support and special education advice to the Board of Education. And where do we get that advice from? From you parents. So our board is made up entirely of parents. We are all parents in Howard County with our children in the special education system, and we advocate on behalf of you. So if you have some concerns and would like to talk and get that parent perspective from an advocacy perspective, feel free to email us. I will put that in the chat for you. Is Stephanie here? Stephanie, you want to show your face and say hi? Say hi. I'm not sure, but anyway, I'm one of the co-chairs. I will put that information into the chat, and feel free to just email us anytime and we will see how we can support you. Thank you.
Okay, so we're coming right up on 8 o'clock. So I'm just going to say thank you again to everyone who has joined us this evening. We had a wonderful turnout of parents. The recording and the PowerPoint will be posted on the Howard County Autism Society website. Melissa and Suzanne are very quick about getting these things posted, so I would encourage you to check there tomorrow. It's just howard-autism.org, and go through the PowerPoint. If you have additional questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. We're here to help you parent to parent with as much advice as we can give you. So thank you very much for joining, and have a wonderful evening.